Osorio, who will be speaking on the impacts of disability policy and its implementation on deaf university students and applied anthropological approach, and she's advised by Dr. Kevin Gilnington.
That was a very preemptive applause, but I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tylin Osorio, and my thesis research is titled The Impacts of Disability Policy and Its Implementation on Deaf University Students, an Applied Anthropological Approach. These photos before you are from the Deaf President Now movement at Gallaudet University, Washington, D.C. in 1988. This was during the same timeline as the disability rights movement, inspired by the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement of that time, leading up to the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, of 1990. The ADA has provided increased access for deaf people in the community, the workforce, and post-secondary education. The ADA is vague to allow flexibility for accommodations, provisions leading to variability across universities in how they implement accommodations accessibility policy. Although history has shown an overall steady increase of enrollment into post-secondary institutions, the gap between deaf graduate and hearing graduate completion has increased over the years, with a 15.5% gap in 2021 compared to a 14.4% gap in 2008. So this all begs the question, how is policy implementation affecting the success of deaf students? As I turn to existing literature relating to deaf education, I noted that although education is a long-studied topic among deaf studies, there are no studies that turn a critical eye to policy implementation and the policy actors responsible for deaf students' access to university life academically and socially. In turning to the small number of anthropological work conducted on deaf education, I noticed the same gap. In contributing to this gap in the literature, I asked, how do people negotiate policy? That is, how is policy practiced by accommodations coordinators and other policy actors? And how do students respond to policy practices? In addition to the previously mentioned gap, the existing literature in deaf studies has used qualitative methods to analyze the experience of deaf students. However, many of the studies lead towards a deaf as medical and deaf as cultural dichotomy. Deaf anthropology has moved away from this dichotomy by analyzing deafness as a spectrum and disabilities as a cultural construct, meaning it is the culture that is disabling, not the individual. An anthropological approach to policy attempts to unearth the assemblage of actors, practices, and influences that shape policy decisions, their implementations, and their results. I use Bourdieu's concept of practices and structures while noting that his concept of habitus is limiting, since part of my investigation is to gain insight into the resistances to power dynamics and policy implementation. I also acknowledge that while Bourdieu saw economic structure as a separate entity, I further myself by portraying the university as a kind of participant in the larger economic field. Using this theoretical framework, the study explores how social actors within the university navigate, implement, or contest disability policy, and in turn, how their practices ultimately impact the experiences of deaf students and how they respond to these practices. In this study, I used qualitative methods in addition to policy analysis to conduct investigation at State University, a large publicly funded university in the U.S. All deaf students, regardless of language preference, could participate as long as they were registered with SAS. I provided the recruitment materials to SAS and they disseminated the information to their deaf students. A total of 8 deaf students, 5 that use spoken English and 3 that use ASL participated in the study along with 2 accommodations coordinators. Although I conducted policy analysis, interviews, and focus groups, today I focus on the findings from the interviews. Being that the sample size for the study is small and may not be representative of all of the deaf students at the university. This study also does not account for students intersecting identities such as race, gender, or class. The intent for this study is for future research to build onto this study. Now I will discuss my findings. The structure in which all the departments, policy actors, and protocols responsible for accommodations reside lack organization, communication, accountability, and resources, creating a challenge rather than allowing for implementation and enforcement, and creating space for the contestation and resistance of disability policy. This in turn bears more weight on the shoulders of SAS, Student Accommodation Services, to ensure that accommodations and access provisions are being met at an institutional level. This is evidenced by Jane and Margaret's commentary that with the reduction of disability policy, actors and roles, SAS has become the informal central ADA source or expert. With the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office no longer being the campus accommodations liaison, and with the reduction of the ADA coordinator's role to mostly handling ADA complaints, SAS is where most turn to for guidance and assistance. Other policy actors within the institutional field, regardless of department or position, are dependent on SAS to provide them with knowledge and accommodations and access provisions, or even the provisions themselves. The accommodations coordinators, who care greatly about disability rights, negotiate between providing time they do not have to ensure access and not providing their time, risking the possibility that provisions to access may be oversighted and ignored. This is evidenced by Jane's experience with an ADA parking violation on campus, and how in bringing this to the attention of the head of parking, realized that they were unfamiliar with ADA requirements. Therefore, Jane had to put in more effort and time by educating the head of parking to ensure proper access outside of her jurisdiction. Deaf students face a complex institutional structure with differing power dynamics. Depending on the setting within the institution, such as in the classroom, at a social event, on campus, or at the bookstore, may warrant different practices. Their practices are dependent on the strategies they develop in relation to what they see as their challenges, and more generally in the way they perceive the world, but they are also dependent on the practices instilled by other social actors within the field. The practices of others, such as peers, instructors, staff, and other social agents of the institutional field towards deaf students, are impacted partly by their awareness and knowledge of interacting with deaf students. These students found themselves negotiating and contesting the various ways social actors provide or do not provide accommodations and access. Students sought to build their networks of support for help in negotiating their way through universities' policies and practices as they sought to establish spaces between themselves and these policies and practices, carving out social realms that they marked with the notion of responsibility. Carter talked about his experience with a difficult instructor and how, in an attempt to use SAS as accommodations enforcement, was perceived by the instructor as talking bad about him, creating an uncomfortable situation for Carter, altering his practice moving forward to negotiating accommodations discrepancies himself without the use of SAS as policy enforcement. Deaf students use peer support as a practice to navigate the challenges they faced being deaf in a dominantly hearing university, whether it was as a supplement or replacement for a lack of academic and social accommodations, or as a connection to their hearing counterparts, as evidenced by Stanislaus' experience with his ASL friends acting as a bridge to meet and socialize with other hearing students. Deaf students' practices entail assigning or being assigned responsibility. Students allocated extra responsibility onto themselves as a response to the lack of resources or support they were receiving from policy actors and in an effort to ensure success. In many ways, students felt responsible over communications and interactions with instructors, peers, employees to ensure that they got what they needed, as evidenced by Corey's experience being ignored by staff at the university bookstore, even though he had everything written out on his phone, creating a situation where he ultimately took it upon himself to find what he needed no matter how long it took. In social settings, some students felt responsible for figuring out ways to obtain any misinformation, and in requesting interpreters. Students felt responsible in navigating the accommodations request process, not with the event sponsor, but with the SAS or the on-campus interpreting agency, which are behind-the-scenes entities that the event sponsors would reach out to, not the deaf student. In taking up this responsibility, there is confusion with the two entities on campus responsible for contracting interpreters, as evidenced by Stanislaus's experience with requesting accommodations. This study contributes to and builds on prior deaf studies and anthropological works in deaf anthropology, and by highlighting a neglected nexus of deaf anthropology and anthropology of policy as a space to more wholly analyze not only the deaf student experience, but how policy practices make an impact on those experiences. It is not enough to gather the experiences of deaf students without contextualizing their experiences and practices within the overall workings of policy practices in the institution. Analyzing federal and university disability policy while investigating the roles, responsibilities, and experiences of those in charge of implementing those policies are crucial in understanding how and why deaf students' experiences are what they are, and in providing nuanced implications and recommendations for policy initiatives. Thank you.